August 6th, 1945, 8:14 a.m. 31,000 feet above the Japanese mainland. The air inside the Boeing B-29 Superfortress is cold, thin, and vibrating with the hum of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Inside the Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets feels the aircraft lurch upward as nearly 5 tons of dead weight. A single, blunt-nosed casing known as Little Boy is released into the morning light. Below, the city of Hiroshima is waking up. It is a Monday. High school students are clearing fire breaks. Soldiers of the 2nd General Army are beginning their morning calisthenics on the parade grounds of Hiroshima Castle. The sky is a brilliant, cloudless blue. 43 seconds later, at 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, the world does not hear an explosion. It experiences a transformation. A light, brighter than 1,000 suns, bleaches the horizon, erasing the distinction between sky and earth. In that silent, searing microsecond, the temperature at the center of the burst reaches 60 million degrees Celsius. For the Japanese soldiers looking up, it is the last thing they will ever see, a light that does not just blind, but dissolves the very fabric of reality. The age of conventional warfare has ended. The era of the atom has begun. By the summer of 1945, the Empire of Japan was a wounded predator, cornered but lethally defiant. The Pacific Theater had become a meat grinder of unprecedented proportions. To the west, the Japanese mainland was a fortress, and to the east, the American military machine was fueling a momentum that seemed unstoppable, yet the cost of every mile gained was measured in rivers of blood. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa had redefined the limits of human endurance and military casualty rates. On Okinawa alone, over 12,000 Americans had perished, while the Japanese losses exceeded 100,000, including thousands of civilians who chose suicide over surrender. In Washington and at the military headquarters in Guam, the arithmetic of war was becoming increasingly grim. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, titled Operation Downfall, was projected to result in over 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese deaths. The Japanese leadership had initiated Ketsugo, the decisive operation, which aimed to turn the entire civilian population into a scorched-earth militia. Schoolgirls were being trained with sharpened bamboo spears. Elderly men were taught to strap explosives to their bodies and crawl under Allied tanks. The concept of Gyokusai, or the shattering of the jewel, dictated that it was better for the entire nation to perish than to accept the dishonor of unconditional surrender. While the infantry braced for a storm of steel on the beaches of Kyushu, a different kind of storm was being brewed in the secret laboratories of Los Alamos, New Mexico. The Manhattan Project, a $2 billion gamble, had successfully tested the world's first nuclear device at the Trinity site in July. Now, the question was no longer if the weapon worked, but where it would be used. The Target Committee, comprised of military brass and scientists like Robert Oppenheimer, met to discuss the fate of Japanese cities. They sought a target that was large enough to contain the damage, a city with significant military value that had remained relatively untouched by previous firebombing raids. Hiroshima sat at the top of that list. It was the headquarters of the 2nd General Army, responsible for the defense of all of southern Japan. It was a vital communications hub, a storage point for military supplies, and an assembly area for troops. But more importantly, Hiroshima was geographically unique. Surrounded by hills on 3 sides, the city sat in a coastal plain that would act as a natural bowl, focusing the blast wave of an atomic weapon to maximize its destructive potential. As the calendar turned to August, the city remained eerily quiet. While Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka had been reduced to charred husks by B-29 incendiary runs, Hiroshima had been spared the rain of napalm. This was not a mercy. It was a cold, scientific calculation. The Americans wanted a pristine target to accurately measure the power of the new weapon. The citizens of Hiroshima, however, grew increasingly anxious. They spoke of Gokuraku Tambo, the paradise insect luck, wondering why they were being ignored by the silver giants in the sky. They did not realize they were being saved for a singular, catastrophic demonstration of force. By early August, the pieces of the puzzle were converging on a small, tear-shaped island in the Marianas called Tinian. Here, the world's most elite bomber unit, the 509th Composite Group, lived in a world of extreme secrecy. Their B-29s were stripped of armor and most guns to carry a single, massive payload. The air crews didn't know the specifics of what they were carrying, only that it was a special weapon capable of ending the war in a single day. The tension on the island was thick as technicians worked in air-conditioned pits to assemble the internal components of a device that defied the laws of traditional ballistics. On the island of Tinian, North Field had become the busiest airfield in the world. Amidst the hundreds of standard B-29s preparing for daily firebombing runs, a secluded area guarded by elite military police housed the 509th Composite Group. This was the final staging ground for Project Alberta, the team tasked with the assembly and delivery of the atomic weapons. The logistics were a nightmare of precision. The gun-type assembly of the little boy bomb was so volatile that it was decided the explosive slugs of uranium would not be inserted until the aircraft was safely in flight, fearing a crash on takeoff would wipe out the entire island base. The strategic landscape in Tokyo was one of desperate delusion. Despite the total destruction of their navy and the strangulation of their supply lines by American submarines, the Japanese Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the Big Six, was deadlocked. Some advocated for a negotiated peace through the Soviet Union, unaware that Stalin was already preparing to invade Japanese-held Manchuria. Others, led by War Minister Korechika Anami, insisted on a fight to the absolute end. They believed that if they could inflict enough casualties during the initial American landings, the United States would lose its will to fight and grant Japan a dishonorable peace that preserved the imperial system and avoided military occupation. Hiroshima, meanwhile, was functioning as a vital cog in this defensive machine. The city housed the 5th Division and the 59th Army, with nearly 40,000 military personnel stationed within its limits. It was a city of wood and paper, of narrow streets and ancient shrines, now bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and military depots. The civilians were no longer just residents. They were part of the total war effort. Children as young as 12 were mobilized for labor service, spending their days tearing down wooden houses to create fire breaks, a desperate attempt to prevent the kind of firestorms that had consumed Tokyo in March. On the night of August 5, 1945, the Enola Gay was taxied to a loading pit. The little boy bomb, painted a dull olive drab and weighing nearly 9,700 pounds, was hoisted into the silver belly of the bomber. Colonel Tibbets, a veteran pilot who had handpicked his crew, had named the plane after his mother only days prior. There was no ceremony, only the mechanical precision of men handling a force they did not fully understand. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6th, the Enola Gay roared down the runway, its engines straining under the weight of the uranium core. As the aircraft climbed into the night sky, headed north toward the Japanese home islands, the crew began the final arming sequence. Captain William Deke Parsons crawled into the unpressurized bomb bay, his hands steady despite the freezing wind, to insert the powder charges that would fire the uranium bullet into the target rings. This was the moment of no return. The weapon was now live. Back in Hiroshima, the sirens had sounded at 7 a.m. as a lone B-29 weather scout, the straight flush, flew over the city. But the citizens had grown accustomed to these small groups of planes. When the all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m., the people emerged from their shelters. They went back to their kitchens to prepare breakfast, back to the factories to build weapons, and back to the schools to serve their emperor. They had no way of knowing that 3 more planes were approaching from the south, traveling at 330 miles per hour, carrying a payload that would render their fire breaks and their bamboo spears utterly irrelevant. To understand the magnitude of what occurred over Hiroshima, one must look through 2 distinct lenses: the cold, mathematical precision of the scientific angle and the rigid, strategic reality of the tactical angle. From the perspective of the Manhattan Project scientists, The little boy bomb was a triumph of physics and engineering. Unlike the complex plutonium implosion design tested at Trinity, the Hiroshima bomb was a gun-type weapon. It relied on a relatively simple but terrifyingly effective mechanism. A cordite charge would fire a hollow uranium-235 cylinder, the bullet, down a steel barrel into a series of solid uranium disks, the target. When the two masses met, they achieved criticality. In a fraction of a microsecond, a chain reaction began where neutrons split atoms, releasing energy in accordance with Einstein's $E equals mc²2. However, the terrifying reality of the weapon lay in its inefficiency. Of the 141 pounds of uranium inside the bomb, only about 2 pounds actually underwent fission, and less than a gram of that matter was converted into pure energy. That single gram of matter, roughly the weight of a paperclip, was enough to level a city. Shift the perspective to the ground, and we find the tactical angle. Hiroshima was not merely a civilian center. It was a hardened military hub. It served as the headquarters for the 2nd General Army, commanded by Field Marshal Shunrika Hata. From the grounds of Hiroshima Castle, Hata oversaw the defense of all of southern Japan, coordinating the movements of hundreds of thousands of troops. The city was a massive barracks, a logistical heart that pumped supplies to the fronts in Kyushu. On the morning of August 6th, thousands of soldiers were out in the open, performing morning drills on the parade grounds. For the American military planners, these soldiers were the primary targets. The goal was to decapitate the Japanese command structure in the South, creating a vacuum of leadership that would make a mainland invasion unnecessary. The tactical intent was to strike a blow so sudden and so absolute that the Japanese high command would realize that no amount of spiritual resolve or ketsugo planning could withstand the power of a single aircraft. The intersection of these two angles, the invisible movement of subatomic particles and the rigid formation of imperial soldiers, was about to create a moment of total destruction that neither the scientists nor the generals could fully visualize until the light arrived. To truly grasp the horror and the chaos of the morning, we must pivot to the civilian angle and the leadership angle. For the people of Hiroshima, the morning of August 6th began with the mundane rhythm of a city at war. In the kitchens of the wooden machiya houses, mothers were lighting charcoal braziers to boil rice. Thousands of school children, mobilized for the building destruction program, were gathering in the city center to pull down structures to create fire breaks. To these civilians, the B-29s were usually a distant threat, silver specks that bypassed their city for larger industrial hubs. There was a sense of unlucky safety, a feeling that the Americans were saving Hiroshima for something specific, though no one could imagine what. When the air raid siren sounded and then died down, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. People stepped out of their shelters, squinting into the bright morning sun, unaware that the air they were breathing was about to be heated to temperatures that would vaporize human bone in an instant. In stark contrast, the leadership angle in Tokyo and at the Japanese high command was one of strategic blindness. While the civilians in Hiroshima lived in the immediate present, the generals were obsessed with a hypothetical future. They were monitoring the movements of the American fleet, convinced that the decisive battle would happen on the beaches of Kyushu. They viewed the B-29 raids as a manageable, if horrific, cost of war. In the Japanese military mindset, total war meant that every citizen was a soldier and every city was a fortress. This mindset created a fatal disconnect. Even as the Enola Gay approached its release point, the Japanese radar operators at Hiromaki detected the 3 incoming B-29s but decided not to scramble fighters. They assumed 3 planes couldn't possibly pose a threat to an entire city. This was a leadership failure born of conventional thinking in an unconventional age. They were prepared for a 1,000-bomber raid. They were not prepared for a single bomb that could perform the work of 1,000 raids. The moral weight of this decision, or lack thereof, would haunt the survivors, as the leadership's refusal to acknowledge the shift in the nature of power led directly to the erasure of 140,000 lives. The intersection of these two realities, the innocent morning routine of a schoolgirl and the calculated indifference of the high command, formed the tragic stage upon which the atomic light was about to fall. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay's bomb bay doors snap open. The little boy bomb is released at 31,060 feet, immediately tumbling into a gravity-driven plunge toward the T-shaped AIOI bridge. For 43 seconds, the city continues to move in its final moments of normalcy. At 1,850 feet, the internal radar altimeters and barometric sensors confirm the target altitude. The firing circuit closes. Inside the weapon, a cordite charge explodes, propelling the uranium bullet down the barrel at 1,000 feet per second. It slams into the uranium rings at the other end. Critical mass is achieved. The detonation is not a bang, but a silent, blinding expansion of energy. In the first 10 millionth of a second, the temperature at the core of the explosion reaches 60 million degrees Celsius, 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun. A fireball of plasma, 300 yards wide, instantly vaporizes everything within its radius. Below the hypocenter, human beings do not have time to feel pain. Their bodies are not burned. They are evaporated, leaving behind nothing but dark, atomic shadows, etched onto stone steps and charred asphalt, where their physical forms had momentarily shielded the ground from the thermal pulse. The thermal radiation, the pica, or flash, travels at the speed of light. It ignites the clothing of people miles away and melts the roof tiles of houses across the city. Within seconds, the air pressure at the center of the blast reaches 35 tons per square meter. A massive shock wave, the dawn, follows the flash, traveling outward at supersonic speeds. It smashes into the city like a solid wall of air, pulverizing reinforced concrete buildings and flattening the wooden homes of civilians like dry leaves. At Hiroshima Castle, the headquarters of the Second General Army simply ceases to exist. Thousands of soldiers, mid-drill, are crushed under the weight of their own collapsing fortifications or tossed into the air by the vacuum created by the rising mushroom cloud. As the shockwave recedes, the vacuum pulls the air back toward the center of the city, fueling a massive firestorm. The thousands of charcoal braziers tipped over in the collapse ignite the ruins. Hiroshima is no longer a city. It is a furnace. Above it all, a towering pillar of white smoke and purple fire climbs 40,000 feet into the atmosphere, visible to the crew of the Enola Gay from 300 miles away. They look back at a world that has been physically rewritten in less than a minute. In the minutes following the blast, a terrifying silence descends over the ruins, broken only by the crackle of growing fires. This is the moment of the black rain. As the mushroom cloud reaches the upper atmosphere, the moisture in the air condenses around the radioactive ash and dust. Massive, oily droplets of water, stained black by the soot of the burning city, begin to fall. To the survivors, the hibakusha, this rain feels like a mercy for their scorched skin, but it is a secondary executioner, carrying concentrated lethal doses of radiation directly into their bodies and the city's water supply. The scene on the ground is one of hellish distortion. Survivors emerge from the rubble with their skin hanging in translucent ribbons from their fingertips, a result of the thermal flash liquefying the fat beneath the surface. They move in a grotesque, slow-motion procession toward the Oder River, driven by an agonizing thirst. But the river offers no sanctuary. It is choked with the bodies of those who jumped into the water to escape the heat, only to drown or succumb to shock. The Japanese soldiers who had survived the initial blast now find themselves in a war they cannot fight. Officers attempt to bark orders, but there is no infrastructure left to command. The military hospitals are gone, the doctors are dead, and the invincible army is reduced to shadows wandering through a landscape of gray ash. At the center of this devastation stands the skeletal dome of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. Directly beneath the burst, the vertical pressure was so intense that the building's walls remained standing while its copper dome was stripped to the bone. It becomes a silent witness to the sun that fell to Earth. Communications with Hiroshima have completely severed. In Tokyo, the Japanese high command is baffled. The telegraph station in Hiroshima has gone off the air, and reports from nearby towns speak of a terrible flash and a magnificent cloud. But the scale of the disaster is beyond their comprehension. They send a young staff officer in a plane to fly toward the city and report back. As he approaches from 5 miles away, he sees not a city, but a giant, burning scar on the earth. There is no smoke from individual fires. The entire horizon is a single, roiling mass of flame and dust. He realizes, then, that the war has not just been lost. It has been transcended by a force that makes conventional bravery obsolete. The hours following the detonation transformed Hiroshima into a laboratory of unprecedented human suffering. As the fires eventually burned themselves out, leaving a wasteland of white ash and twisted steel, a new and invisible terror began to manifest. This was the atomic bomb disease. Soldiers and civilians who had survived the initial blast without a single scratch began to collapse. They were plagued by a sudden, inexplicable lethargy, followed by the appearance of purple spots under the skin, hemorrhages that signaled the internal disintegration of their bodies. The radiation, a silent byproduct of the uranium fission, had shattered the very DNA of those exposed. At the Red Cross Hospital, the few surviving doctors and nurses watched in horror as patients' white blood cell counts plummeted to near zero. There were no medicines for this, no bandages for the invisible wounds of gamma rays. The scientific angle had now become a medical nightmare. People who had seemingly escaped the sun were dying days later, their hair falling out in clumps, their gums bleeding, their internal organs liquefying. It was a secondary wave of death that defied the traditional rules of combat. The physical destruction of the city's infrastructure was absolute. Of the 76,000 buildings in Hiroshima, 70,000 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The city's administrative heart had been surgically removed. The Second General Army, which was supposed to lead the defense of the homeland, was effectively decapitated. Field Marshal Hada survived only because he was at the station at the time of the blast, but his command was a phantom. The soldiers who remained were forced to spend their days cremating thousands of corpses on open pyres, the smoke of the dead hanging over the ruins in a permanent haze. The psychological toll on the survivors, the hibakusha, was equally devastating. In a culture that prized order and communal duty, the total collapse of society led to a profound sense of mujo, the impermanence of all things. The atomic light had not just erased buildings. It had erased the Japanese belief in the sanctity of their soil and the protection of their deities. The survivors wandered the ash-covered streets in a state of psychic numbness, a collective trauma that would define the Japanese identity for generations to come. 3 days after the erasure of Hiroshima, as the Japanese leadership still struggled to comprehend the nature of the new type of bomb, a second sun fell on Nagasaki. This second strike shattered the last remnants of the Ketsugo defense plan. The realization was absolute. The United States did not need to sacrifice 1 million men on the beaches of Kyushu. They could simply sit back and methodically delete every city on the Japanese map from 30,000 feet in the air. The invincible spirit of the imperial soldier was now a relic of a bygone age, rendered powerless against a weapon that utilized the fundamental forces of the universe. In the imperial bunkers of Tokyo, the Big Six were forced into a final, agonizing confrontation with reality. Emperor Hirohito, breaking the traditional silence of the throne, declared that the unthinkable must be endured. On August 15, 1945, his voice, never before heard by the public, was broadcast across the ruins of the empire. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb and the need to pave the way for a grand peace. For the soldiers in the field, the surrender was a psychic shock more powerful than the blast itself. Many officers chose seppuku over the dishonor of defeat, but for the millions of starving civilians and wounded survivors, the announcement brought a hollow, silent relief. The international consequences were immediate and global. The success of the Manhattan Project had sparked a frantic, hidden race for nuclear parity. The Soviet Union, having witnessed the total dominance of the American atomic monopoly, shifted their entire scientific and espionage apparatus toward the development of their own device. The hot war of the 1940s was cooling into the Cold War, a 40-year standoff defined by the concept of mutually assured destruction. The radioactive ruins of Hiroshima became the blueprint for a potential future world, a warning of what total war would look like in the 20th century. The city of Hiroshima itself became a focal point for international relief and scientific study. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC, was established not to treat the survivors, but to study them. For decades, the Hibakusha became the most scrutinized human beings in medical history. Their suffering provided the data for modern radiation safety standards and oncology, a grim contribution to human knowledge born from the fires of 1945. The geopolitical landscape had been permanently altered. The balance of power no longer rested on the size of an army or the bravery of its soldiers, but on the number of warheads in its silos. Today, the city of Hiroshima is a vibrant, modern metropolis, but at its heart lies a deliberate void. The Peace Memorial Park. Amidst the glass and steel, the skeletal remains of the Jinbaku Dome stand as a permanent fossil of the moment the sun fell. It is a place of profound silence, where the only sound is the ringing of the peace bell, a tolling reminder of a lesson the world can never afford to unlearn. The events of August 6, 1945, fundamentally rewrote the human story. Before that morning, war was a contest of attrition, of industrial output, and of the physical courage of men like the Japanese soldiers who stood on those parade grounds. After that morning, humanity entered a new, precarious state of existence. We had discovered the fire of the gods, but we lacked the divine wisdom to manage it. The atomic light did more than erase a city. It illuminated the terrifying reality that for the first time in history, mankind possessed the technical capacity for its own extinction. To the survivors, the Hibakusha, the legacy of the bomb, is not found in the grand movements of geopolitics, but in the quiet persistence of memory. It is found in the shadows etched into stone, the atomic shadows that remain even after the people who cast them are gone. These shadows are perhaps the most haunting artifacts of the Second World War. They are a testament to the fragility of life when confronted with the absolute power of the atom. As we look back through the lens of history, Hiroshima stands as both a graveyard and a lighthouse. It marks the horrific climax of a global conflict and the birth of an era defined by a fragile, nuclear peace. It teaches us that while technology may evolve with terrifying speed, the human cost of conflict remains constant. The light that erased Hiroshima forever serves as a cold, flickering warning to every generation that followed. But the power to end worlds is a burden that requires more than just military might. It requires a profound, collective commitment to ensure that such a light never bleaches the horizon again.